Oh,
And
nice.
yeah, it's very nice. I think we're now live streaming, so we should be live with everyone watching.
Great.
Yes. So yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining me, Zadina Briami, today on Opera in Conversation. This is our regular talk series with professionals in the opera, where we talk everything about opera and the future of opera in the pandemic. And today I'm so excited to be joined by Professor Naomi André, who is a professor of women's studies and Afro-American studies and is an amazing opera musicologist at the University of Michigan. We'll be having a really good discussion. But firstly, let me say, Naomi, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. What a pleasure to be here.
Well, let me just firstly ask, I mean, we were talking a bit beforehand, but how are you? How are you finding the pandemic?
I am hanging in, and there was this great article I read, I think it was the New York Times recently, that talked about how we're all languishing. I mean, some people are super depressed. Maybe there's some people who are super happy. We've gone through our stages of grief, or maybe we're still going through them. And we're just sort of hanging in. However, I will say I'm a little better than that because I love these opportunities to sort of meet new people, talk about opera, and it's not the same as going to an opera, but it sort of makes it alive. So I'm excited about this. I'm hanging in. And you, how are you doing?
I'm okay. Yeah, I think similarly, I have said this so many times on the show before, but I'm just so glad that we are more used to these sort of online formats and we're able to talk to people about opera or whatever it is that we really love. And I feel like there's a lot more global connection somehow, even though we're all naturally isolated.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that. So that's a good thing. And we can sort of have more sort of outreach when we also have our in-person life too.
Mm, definitely. So I think I'm just going to start with an obvious question, which is why opera? You know, what is it about opera that you really love that sort of drew you in from the first moment?
Well, there's so many ways to answer that. So I'll say something that I haven't said to many people, but deep down, I'm an introvert. And I love having the drama on stage and then the private life. And so I'm an introvert who loves to watch. And I love spectacle. I love pageantry. I love the way that opera can say so many different things at once. You have the text and the vocal line, but you have the music underneath, which might not be agreeing with the text, and yet you can pick that all up. You've got the story. Sometimes it's narrative, like A, B, C. Sometimes it's much more abstract. So I love how you can have so much, dare I say, chaos in a good way. And then it sort of is the nice contrast to the life I like to live off stage, or, not that I'm ever on stage, but sort of just my regular life. And then I can get all this wonderful excitement on stage. So I think that's why opera, there's sort of the logistical issues where I was really fortunate to be around opera and have that to be an easy thing and have people introduce me. So just really quickly, my mother is a singer and she had gone to the Juilliard School. She didn't graduate because her father passed on, and her mother in the 60s thought, well, that's not a great thing for a young woman to do. But she is a high coloratura. She's not singing now, but she's a high coloratura. And though she didn't sing opera when I was alive and born, she was singing in churches. She was very religious. So I grew up with the sound of an operatic voice. So it wasn't crazy. It was something sort of the sound, almost Lacanian, with the sound of your mother's voice and what you're used to. I then went to college in New York City, and going to the Metropolitan Opera was super easy and not very expensive because I stood. And at that point, standing was $5, which was less than a movie at that time. And so I had a bunch of friends and we would go to the opera. It's like, oh, there's 7 performances a week, 2 on a matinee and evening performance on Saturday. And it's like, oh, let's at dinner, sometimes even at dinner in the dining hall or right before, it's like, wonder what's going on at the Met tonight. Oh, let's take the subway down and let's go. And it was that easy. I look back and think how, oh man, if only I had those days where I had the time and the accessibility. And so I just got to see a lot of stuff. So that was always percolating in the back of my mind.
Wow, what an incredible story. I mean, I'm so jealous that you managed to see productions at the Met for $5. Are there any highlights that from productions you can remember that stand out?
Absolutely. There were many, but it's fun to think of my first performances. So I started going in the fall of 1985. And what happened was I didn't just say, hey, let's go to the Met. I had a friend who was in high school and which was out of New York City, but he and I was a year ahead of him. And I said, hey, we used to go to all the music things together before. And we were just really dear, super wonderful friends. We weren't dating. But just because he was sort of this nerdy guy and I was this sort of free-flowing artsy person. And so, but we ended up going to all this music stuff together. And he said, oh, you're going to be in New York City. We should go to the Met. And I'm like, oh yeah, sure, Eric. Look me up. And he did. But we went, so he was sort of guiding what we saw, and that was fine for me. So the first opera I saw and stood through was Strauss's Rosenkavalier. And it was gorgeous, beautiful set, but just really long. There were no super titles at that point. And I think it was Gwyneth Jones was singing, Tatiana Troyanos was the Rosenkavalier and Octavian, and I think it was Kathleen Battle who was the Sophie. I mean, it was this incredible, magical cast. Then the second opera, so I was just sort of blown away. There was all these crystal chandeliers and stuff, and it's just this wash of sound. So when he said, oh, they're doing Kovanchina by Mussorgsky, and I'm like, sure, let's go. So I saw, it wasn't Marriage of Figaro or Barber of Seville or some of the standard rep. It was, these big, wonderful, incredible productions. So those two really stand out. And then there were all the others that happened afterwards.
Wow, that's such an incredible story. I'm so glad that you had the sort of access to opera from such a young age. I mean, can you tell us a bit about how then that, I guess, transported into it becoming academic research?
So that's a great question, because it was sort of my pleasure, my sort of, I don't want to say guilty pleasure, but going to the opera and sort of hanging out. And I never, in the beginning, I would read the libretto and, but then we were just going regularly, and it was just like, you'd go, and it was kind of a mystical experience because there weren't the super titles or seat titles as they actually have at the Met. And you sort of went, and you sort of, at that point in the 80s and even up through the early 90s, there was the big, beautiful Zeffirelli sets, or, some people really liked, but the acting was, it wasn't always what it is today, where there's so much emphasis on the production and the acting, and singers have to be super thin and all of that. This was opera where the singing was the main thing and the visual spectacle was something sort of added on. And so with oh gosh, sorry, did I forget your question? Forgive me. I get so sort of drawn up in describing what it was.
That's completely fine. The question was just, I guess, talking about how that initial love of opera when you were quite young kind
Yes.
of then became, I guess, academic
An
research.
academic thing. I should probably be taking notes. Sorry, I'm just so, but that's sort of, it was this really beautiful sort of sensual, where I saw and I heard, and I was sort of there, and with the velvet thing you would lean on for standing room, or when you could find a seat, the beautiful red velvet seats there. So it was for fun. And I was, the Barnard curriculum is very close to the Columbia curriculum at that point. Barnard is a women's college of Columbia University, and they have, an excellent musicology program, but there wasn't an emphasis on opera. So I got my sort of standard music history background with a lot of time with the medieval and Renaissance and 17th century. Then you sort of move to 18th and 19th and maybe a little bit of the 20th century at that point. So opera was not something I thought about in the classroom. And then I remember when I was going to graduate school, and I was really fortunate and had a lot of programs to choose from. And I thought, well, I'll go to Harvard because they have people really in every area. So I thought I was interested. I had taken a Monteverdi seminar in my senior year. So I thought I wanted to focus on Monteverdi. And opera the 19th century opera, that other stuff, because they weren't doing Monteverdi at the Met, and they still aren't because that's just not done. They did add Giulio Cesare in the time when I was there. So a Handel opera was kind of the earliest they went. And so I ended up choosing a dissertation topic. I studied, with these great thinkers and got to learn all these aspects of musicology, but there wasn't really much opera. There was one course by Lewis Lockwood on Fidelio, but that was really a Beethoven course, which is great. And we learned about Leonora 1805 and Leonora 1806 and Fidelio 1814. But in terms of sort of looking at the genre and how it developed and the history, it was much more sort of how does this fit into Beethoven's world, and then and his output, from the middle period to the later period, or the heading towards the later period in 1814. So there was this the sense of, when I came up for a dissertation topic, and this was so I was in graduate school from 89 to 95. Then I came here to Michigan and I finished in 96. So it was really a, so the emphasis, sorry, I must be getting older and having these moments. So the emphasis was on traditional musicology things, but there also was an emphasis just beginning with looking at the new musicology, which brought in gender and sexuality. So I thought, I'm really interested in those things. And so I ended up choosing a topic. What did I love? What was my passion? How do you choose a dissertation topic? Those are all sort of big issues. And I thought, I'm really loving Verdi. And that seems to speak to me. And I was really interested in Amneris in Verdi's Aida. And that was sort of, without trying to reconstruct the whole thought process, I ended up looking at the women in opera who didn't die and who had big roles. And I chose Amneris from Verdi's Aida, moving backwards, Eboli from Don Carlos in 67, and then Azucena from Il Trovatore in 53. And how those are operas where you have not just one leading soprano, which becomes sort of the norm after 1850, but two leading women, and one dies and then one doesn't. And so that's what those were the types of questions I thought, I could spend a lot of time, that can be a dissertation, that would be fun. I thought, looking at the women and gender element, sort of how does Verdi represent and characterize his women? I thought that would be sort of the unusual thing. But in that context of musicology at Harvard at that point, doing a 19th century Italian opera topic was weird. There was one other Verdi dissertation by Jim Hepakowski from 1979 on Falstaff, and it was kind of leading to a critical edition type of dissertation, asking these weird, scary questions about gender. Were well, that's just me asking questions that push the boundaries a bit, but I had a great time doing it. I worked with Reinhold Brinkmann, who was not a Verdian, but he said, I will look at Verdi now. He was a Schoenberg and Brahms person, and he was great. He let me ask questions. He gave me enough guidance without squashing anything. My analysis was looking very much at letters and the libretto and the source for the libretto, and a musical analysis. So I wasn't doing anything too wild, but just the whole topic could have been strange to him, and he was really open about it. He was a fabulous advisor that way.
I'm so glad to hear that you had had such a great time and had support and everything. And it's so interesting to me, as someone who is both traditionally a sort of opera student in terms of musicology, but also someone who has directed opera in the past. I think this issue of women in opera and the sort of the often violence and misogyny and murder that's sort of enacted against them so often is obviously such a huge topic within opera studies and musicology and everything. Is it something that you think you're seeing a change in, particularly on stage in productions? Because obviously you can't really change, well, you can, but you can't really change the fact that they die in the score. So is that something that you've sort of seen in recent years, would you say?
Yes, one thing I have seen is how productions sort of treat different operas. And I think being much more the opposite of tone deaf, sort of being open and listening to what sort of the current world is like. For example, when I was first learning about Don Giovanni, and I had seen Don Giovanni in college, but it was when I was a graduate student teaching as a teaching fellow is what they call them, a teaching assistant for an opera course, looking at Don Giovanni and this whole issue of that opening scene and issues of rape and consent. And we just didn't really talk about it because we sort of put, well, that's on the opera stage, so that's not real. And yet, of course, it's not real. And we know it's the opera. And yet when we have something that's actively sort of embodied right now in front of us with people from today, it's hard not to think about these things. And also, as we're learning more, there's more attention to what type of sexual violence is happening on campuses for the very audiences we're teaching this to. It can certainly be something that can feel a little frightening to then have this in art and not to bring that up and to talk about it. So I think one thing, or at least in the classroom in the university, there's a lot more discussion by a lot of people. I know I do this in my classrooms, that we don't just turn a blind eye to what's happening on stage when it's sort of that this is something, not everybody goes to the opera growing up. So we're introducing this genre and then people are like, wait, what? That's going on? I also think that opera companies are becoming more open about sort of what do these things mean? How do we perform these operas? It was never an issue that people talked about when I was going to the opera of saying, why are we using blackface makeup on Otello and Aida? And why do we have yellow face makeup for Cho-Cho-san, Butterfly, and in Turandot? Like, that doesn't happen in films or Broadway or TV or even in high schools anymore. What does this mean that we're doing this? And a lot of people would say to me when I brought that up, oh, Naomi, you're too sensitive. It's not real. It's on the stage. Oh, nobody cares about those things. It's opera. And I'm thinking, I care a lot about opera and I care about those things too. So let's begin to talk about it. But I found, and this sort of hooks into my current research, that nobody was asking, there wasn't an easy way to talk about it. I wasn't saying, this is horrible, we should censor opera, but more like, this is something we need to talk about because it's a little painful to see this. It's resonating weirdly. Nobody else is doing this or other genres in big forms. Why can't we talk about it? So that's the long-winded answer to sort of why and how opera, and sort of my coming around, sort of really having questions that I needed to ask, and like a knot I needed to untie. What's going on here?
And I think, as someone who, as I said before, is obviously a student of this kind of research, I'm very grateful that you've been able to lay the foundations for thinking of opera in this way. Because I think I was reading, so for student or for listeners who might not know, one of your publications is called Black Opera and explores, lots of different issues to do with race and opera and performance. And I was reading the blurb and I think I was quite struck by a phrase which just said something about opera being both a cultural and political force in today's sort of landscape, which I think is such an accurate sort of statement, because as you said, people for some reason have certain misgivings about it and sort of are able to let things like, the performance of blackface, for example, let those things kind of slide, which seems rather strange, especially given the current climate. So I guess this kind of leads quite nicely on something else I wanted to discuss, which is the obvious development of opera within the COVID-19 pandemic. And I've seen from the UK, there's been a large response, particularly to the growing awareness of movements like Black Lives Matter, to sort of try to promote more awareness and, I guess, representation within opera companies. Is this something that we're seeing also in the US? And do you think it's going to have a lasting impact on how opera is made? Big question, I know.
Yeah, no, and it's a great one. So one, to answer the one question easily, yes, these issues around what are we doing around representation on stage, and is there sort of how Black lives, and then we had just a few weeks ago, or maybe closer to a month now, there was all these horrible events at some spas in Atlanta with anti-Asian violence. And if you just think in these last couple of years, we've had all these things around immigration under the former presidency, sort of getting immigration services involved and not letting people, the Dreamers, the Latinx communities who were born here and who've lived here but might not have official legal documentation. And then let's go back just to 2001, where we have 9/11, and that's sort of this Middle Eastern and Arabic type of Islamophobia. So we have lots of different groups, this whole history with Blackness and the enduring legacy of slavery and its afterlives. So it's not just, I look at Blackface, but I want to mention that I'm looking at lots of things. I talk about Blackness in opera because, one, I can speak about that from many different angles as a Black woman who sits in the opera house. And sort of the resonance there is like, well, I'm a Black person talking about this. But I also hope it becomes a stepping stone for other people and other different identities that are underrepresented or not represented and not discussed, that it can help say, well, here's one sort of model. Let's look at different platforms for how do we talk about these things. So yes, I have, a nice thing is that some artistic organizations, or even that I've been aware of, have been looking at this before last summer and the George Floyd murder, as well as Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, and the names go on. I mean, this has been going on for so long. Emmett Till in the 50s and even beyond, earlier, but it's just become, I think, a much more visual thing. I think probably around 2012 for me with Trayvon Martin, but when video cameras and things were just talking about it. So I think it's become a bigger part of our lives here in the US. I know the best about, but maybe in other places. And the solidarity that we found around the world with Black Lives Matter, which was rooted here in the United States. So I think opera companies and those are the folks I'm dealing with mainly, have been interested in this. They've seen the writing on the wall for a while. There are also certain granting agencies, and I don't think this is a bad thing, when they say, what are you doing around diversity, equity, and inclusion? So if that's what the granting agencies are talking about, then you've got the opera companies or artistic agencies saying, oh, wow, we need to focus on this. My particular, I don't know if we want to segue into this, but I've been working with the Seattle Opera for a couple of years as the inaugural scholar in residence, which was just something where I had given, I was on a panel and then I was moderating a conversation for Seattle Opera, and they said, because everybody asked me, how did you get this? In fact, people have said, how did you wrangle this? And I said, oh my goodness, I had no idea. But they are a company that had a lot of people of color, and I'm talking Hawaiian, Japanese, African-American, Caribbean, as well as African-American, Caribbean and Afro-American, Latinx. So it wasn't just like the one token person, but there was a wide range of folks on their administrative staff. And so they had been working internally. And then with these different panels, they were doing a production of Porgy and Bess. And I was on a panel for that. And they said, oh, wow, we like the way she's talking about these things. They had me back to moderate. They have these community conversations to sort of public outreach. And they had a fabulous one on decolonizing allure in their production for Carmen. And then they said to me, oh yeah, that was really great. We can talk about that more later if you want. But then they said, we want to formalize this relationship. And I was like, wait, what? How do I formalize a relationship with an opera company when I'm a scholar, I'm a nerdy person? And it's been a wonderful experience, and they have continued it even through the pandemic, where we meet on Zoom. I've done some podcasts. They had a streaming presentation, radio broadcast of an Otello from 1967. And I gave some intermission remarks. So this is sort of a wide wandering response, but I think these are issues that are on a lot of people's radar. And there's also the issue that opera has to contend with a very unfortunate, though I think deserved, place of being elitist and not that open to a lot of audiences. And so for companies to try to reach out and do something more, it's wonderful to say, oh, anybody can buy a ticket to the opera company. But if you think 1955 with Marian Anderson, who sort of metaphorically really opened the doors, opera was a segregated space before. Companies need to embrace the legacy and the current reality that it's not always seen as the most welcoming to everyone. And it's wonderful to see companies that are really doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. And you guessed completely correctly that I wanted to talk about the Seattle Opera Post. I think it's so wonderful that a company like that are working, with different people, with academics, for example, to sort of talk about these issues. And as you say, sort of, really get them, happening. Because I feel like often there's a lot of sort of, I hate to say this, but tokenistic kind of comments. Yes. Where people will, opera companies will kind of pledge to employ a certain number of people of color, or a certain number of cast members or something, but often the sort of change that we need to be seeing isn't happening where it needs to happen, and that's ultimately at the top, in the boardrooms, in the sort of big meetings that are happening. Is that something, I can see you're nodding, but is that something that you agree with?
Oh, you're singing my song, singing my aria. So I love this idea of thinking of this diversity. What does it mean in an opera house? Well, it means so many things. One really trenchant way is what I see at Seattle with the sort of the people making decisions, and the general director, Christina Scheppelman, is totally on board with this. The casting people, they're interested in it. So it has to happen in the administrative offices, but you're right, it has to be further with the boards and what they're going to support. And then there's the very visible thing of who's singing on stage and who's in the pit in the orchestra, and whose stories are being told. And is it just the stories where it's an imagined past of whiteness? And that's fine. That's where a lot of the canon is. And I'm somebody who absolutely adores those canonic operas. I also think I'm not alone in somebody who's a big opera fan and has been going for years. I want to see new things too. There's something particularly special, wonderful when you see opera sort of bloom right now in my lifetime. I'll never know what it's like to be somebody in the 18th century. And so, although I love the Marriage of Figaro and I've taught it, and I also sing very sort of amateur, and I sing in a choir, but I remember singing Cherubino's arias and looking a little bit. But so I love this, and I want to see new things, but I'm always seeing the past as it is for me, as it's being presented in my present. So to learn about the 18th century and working with Marriage of Figaro, that it was one of the Beaumarchais plays that was written around the French Revolution, and issues of class and gender and sexual sort of terror that's happening behind the scenes. This meant things in the 18th century, but this still means a lot, sadly, today, as we think of different hierarchies and power around sort of gender and predators. And we think of sort of, I love how we get women friendship in Figaro, where the Countess and Susanna, there's certainly an employer-employee relationship, but there's also the Countess sort of goes out there and she does something very risky because, she's a highborn lady, and or at least her position is now, and she shouldn't have to rely on her servant. And yet Susanna is there for her. And it's like, there's this wonderful breaking down of class lines, even within sort of the women and those friendships. So I think all of this is what makes opera so good today. And it's nice and relevant today. And Black people have friends, Latina women are friends. So why can't we have like those people in these roles. It's not just like, oh, like none of us know what the 18th century, we haven't lived there, but we've lived today, those issues carry over. Let's see people today that represents our current realities in these roles.
Absolutely. I think yeah, completely agree with that. And it's sort of so important, as you said, to sort of, obviously we all really love the old operas and, we love Mozart and everything. But I think there has to be a point where you have to stop and think, am I programming this, or am I directing this, or am I singing this in a way which is actually looking forwards rather than looking back? And I think particularly when you mentioned just now the sort of advent of new productions as well. I mean, this is another question I wanted to ask you, which is just, have you seen a sort of big change in terms of the ways in which opera has been produced? I guess particularly during the pandemic with, digital productions and internet opera and everything. Has there been any sort of trends that have stood out to you with all of these?
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing operas where people don't hug and kiss, but, but besides that, um, there is a certain, and this is a good question as I'm thinking about it, there's a certain intimacy we have on Zoom or with online. It's different than having an opera production where you put the camera and it's on a big stage and you sort of get the movie version. What I've noticed during this pandemic with internet operas is that there's a certain type of the space is smaller, even if you're out in a parking lot or something, but there's an intimacy so you can see them. That's kind of cool. I mean, the thing I love so much about opera is that you're in the room, in the space, your body is where the sound is bouncing off of. If you cough, that's all part of it, not that you want to do that, but there's the real live aspect. And yet so frequently you're far away, and depending on, how expensive your tickets are, there's still, you're far. But with these operas online, I guess this is sort of the biggest point I want to make, there's a different intimacy that you have as you're watching it. So even though we're used to videos and DVDs and the Metropolitan Opera and high definition, and there are other companies that are doing this, there's something different with the pandemic. There's also, it'll be really interesting to see how are these operas working after the pandemic, and we can go back in person. And so we're just so grateful for what we get. Even when I'm thinking of an example, the Michigan Opera Theater recently hired Yuval Sharon, who just is such an innovative thinker. And I got to see his production this past October, Twilight Gods, which was a reimagining of Wagner's Götterdämmerung, the Twilight of the Gods, in a parking structure. That's what we call them here in Michigan, a parking lot, but it's a structure because it has many. It was like a term that was used when I, moving from New York here. And I guess, I wasn't really driving much in the city, but here it's like, oh, the parking structure. So it's a thing because this is Detroit and we all have our cars and love our cars, and we're all, also needing to pay attention to the environment and stuff. But the car provided this really interesting space and they just choreographed this and had great volunteers where you went into sort of this holding space, and then 8 cars at a time would go through different levels of the parking structure. And there would be Morris Robinson singing Hagen. And, he was just sort of in his corner, but he could look at you through your window. So it was, this was October when things just felt like they were always getting worse. The vaccine was not in sight. And yet they made it, we had our windows up somehow, and this worked beautifully. They had different radio stations, and there would be people who'd hold signs to tell you, which radio station to switch to, and you could hear them through your radio. You could see them. You were just, not that far away, closer than it was like you were in the pit or, like so close. And that was amazing. So I would love, I can only imagine the work and the planning, but that's opera, opera takes so much, but this was a new thing. And I don't know what it was like for the poor singers in there with the car exhaust and stuff, but bravi, they were amazing. And it was a reimagining too. We had the Rhine Maidens sort of coming down. They were in their blue, there were 3 of them. And they were just, it was great. Siegfried's Tod was, oh, on the wall they had graffiti about Siegfried dying. I mean, it was this really encompassed, it did sort of what Yuval Sharon does with reimagining opera, and yet was so respectful of the Wagner Götterdämmerung. I would love to see something like that again.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see it too. That sounds brilliant. And I'm a big Yuval Sharon fan. I think his work is really just so interesting in the ways, as we were sort of discussing before, the ways in which you can present opera in new ways. I think it's just wonderful. Is that something that you're going to be incorporating into your teaching? Just out of curiosity, really.
Well, what I did so I was teaching a race and identity in music course, which has a lot on opera in there this past fall. And so I definitely mentioned it and told students, but, I also realized that the tickets went fast and they all had to have cars to be able to get into, and to be in their car seeing it. But one thing that worked really well was, and I'm hoping this opera continues to be around. Nashville Opera did an amazing thing with an opera called One Vote One. So ONE, One Vote, WON. And it was, had been commissioned. I think they might have had a 50th or some anniversary season. So they were planning to commission a new work. And it was about the passing of the 19th Amendment with women's suffrage. Then with COVID, they decided to sort of keep that, but make it all about Black women. So it was an opera with 3 women, and there was one, so just a really small cast. It was socially distanced, and they had because Tennessee also, I think, was the vote that ratified that 19th Amendment. And so they start with Gloria, who is in today. And this was released in, I think, early September, and it ran through November, which was the big presidential election here. And Gloria is an African-American woman, doesn't really think her vote matters. What should she do? It's election day. And then you have somebody, one of the Black Tennessee suffragettes, who pops up and says, you need to vote. And then there was Diane Nash from the civil rights era, who was talking about voting. And so it became this sort of Black women's votes, everybody's votes matters. And they had this, I saw it and I paid, a little bit of money. It was just over 30 minutes, like 33 minutes. And they had it streaming. And I was like, oh yes, I'm paying my money. But then they got some funding, or just decided that if you had a class and you wanted to have them come to the opera, you wrote to them and said, here's my class, here are the number of students. And they gave me a website, a link. And so my whole class watched it. And it felt like sort of opera. I talk about an engaged opera where we ask questions about how operas resonate today. I'm also interested in this idea of maybe an activist opera. And this feels like, encouraging people to vote. It was just beautifully done. So that's, I'm happy to talk about it. And One Vote One, we want that to come back. And David Ragland was the composer, and I can't remember the librettist's name, but it's important. It was an all-Black team, just incredible.
That sounds, really incredible. I will definitely look that up, and if I can, I'll try and put a link in the description of this video. I mean, it's interesting that you mention the word activist, because I think I've seen in an interview before that you have said, I think several times, that there is an activist part of opera, of what opera can do. Is that something that you still believe, that you're still seeing today, would you say?
I do believe it. And here is how I'm thinking of what is activist about opera. It's where we see experiences on the stage and we hear different stories and narratives. And again, with opera having this sort of what I feel is a magical superpower where you can get so many different voices. The music is the orchestra is a voice, the text is a voice, the music, the melody, and those things, 3 things can work together. They can work apart. Like, when to trust someone or not to trust someone in opera, because the music tells us, regardless of what their text is saying. And then, you can add the acting and all of that. So I think with when you get new stories, when you get stories, and I look a lot at operas that involve a Black collaboration. So sometimes operas where you have a Black librettist and or a Black composer, and the story is on a Black subject. so it's a messy term, but this idea of what is Black opera. And so you can have, for example, I think Margaret Garner is a great example, where you have a white composer, an Italian-American, Richard Danielpour, but it's the Margaret Garner's, the historical character on whom Toni Morrison's Pulitzer Prize winning novel, Beloved, is based. Margaret Garner is Seth. And then Toni Morrison wrote the libretto. So we've got this, and it was a co-production between Michigan Opera Theater, Cincinnati Opera, and oh shoot, I think it's Opera Philadelphia. Oh, so keeping all these things in my mind. Oh, sorry, I might be wrong on that third one, but it was a three-way commission. It was a big opera. I got to see its first run here in Michigan in 2005. It came back in 2009. So to have that story where you see there's one point where Margaret Garner, she runs away is escaping slavery. I mean, you see this awful sort of rape that happens with her. You see her husband being sold, and you see her run away with the two children, and she kills the children so that they're not enslaved. I mean, she's a real controversial figure. You see lynching, she's hanged at the end. And so it's absolutely horrific. But to see this on the opera stage and have this story, that is an activist element to telling new stories in such an unlikely genre, in opera that's making it grand, in that the subject is full of awe and grandness. Not that it's a great happy thing, but that it's elevating these stories so they're seen. And these operas, I've been following a bunch. There's another opera that is by a white librettist, Daniel Sonnenberg, called The Summer King, and it's about the life of Josh Gibson, who was a baseball player in the National Negro Leagues. And they called him the Black Babe Ruth because he was a power hitter and a catcher. And they thought he was going to be the one to integrate baseball rather than Jackie Robinson. And so I think Sonnenberg, I haven't spoken with him, but I think he's a big baseball fan. He's not Black, he's a white man, but he's writing this story and putting it out there. And to me, even though it doesn't involve, and it's tough because some people want to say, no, who gets to represent whom and sort of what voices, but there is such a sensitivity and care in there that I'm like, yeah, this is an important opera on a Black topic. And it's elevated. I didn't know who Josh Gibson was before. I don't dislike baseball, but I'm not, I don't follow those things. But now that's a name. And that's like, oh, team sports and the National Negro Leagues. And, it's put it on my radar to realize this is really important. So that's the activist part, changing how we see history.
Yeah, wow. And I thank you so much for going into that. It's so interesting and fulfilling to sort of hear about these new products that are being made and everything. Before we turn to the questions from our audience, I will just return to one thing that we touched on very briefly earlier, and it kind of related to this activist thing. You were saying in your role at Seattle Opera, you were sort of talking about the different ways in which we view characters and racial stereotypes and general things in opera. And I think you mentioned something about Carmen that you said you wanted to explain a tiny bit more on. I just wanted to ask that because I know that lots of our audiences will be familiar with Carmen and will love it. So
well, here is this wonderful programming idea. So Seattle Opera has these community conversations that are free. And I think they really make an effort to make it so it's not just the subscribers and the insiders who know about this, but to advertise it and get it out there. So it's sort of open to the community. And they had this, I was the moderator. They had another professor from the University of Washington who had written on Latinx music. Then they had 3 women of color artists. They had a Filipino woman with spoken word who does all this wonderful activism stuff, sort of politicized with her identity in theater and spoken word. And they had 2 Black, one was a painter and one was sort of a painter and worked in sort of plastic arts, sculpture. And so I gave sort of the overview, some important things about how this is, what the story is, as well as the genesis of the work from the Merome novella into the libretto. And this is France looking at Spain and the Roma population. So I did sort of the traditional Carmen stuff. And then we talked about sort of these, what does it mean for sort of these current artists? And the other professor was looking at mariachi music and that type of Latinx music. So things that were very much grounded in today. There also was a performance of the habanera and I think also the seguidilla. So people got to hear like a little performance. They got sort of the history or a little bit to help them if they hopefully would go to the opera when it's performed. And then they got to think about this theme as it relates today with all these women of color. And I thought, wow, this is this involvement with them. And I was like, and they, flew me out to Seattle from Michigan, to do this. And I was just thinking, this is exciting. And the questions and the conversations were great. So you had the audience thinking not just about Carmen at the end of the 19th century, but also of who are artists today and who are women of color in sort of the popular imagination and what are they doing? And yeah, so that was decolonizing allure and breaking away from the idea that women of color are always kind of this overly exoticized, sexually available, creative, artistic, entertaining, sumptuous, consumed by our eyes type of persona. So that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that certainly sounds brilliant. And I think for me personally, as someone who just loves Carmen and sort of, could sing it in the shower all day, I'm so glad to hear that you're sort of working on it in that way. I'm just going to turn to a few questions from our audience just while we have a tiny bit of time. This first one is really quite big, so I appreciate you might want to go into all of it. But what do you think the future holds for music education post-pandemic?
Oh, that's such a big one. A thing I lament is that in the United States, at least, there's no systemic music education. And sadly, it's left instead to the places that can afford to do the arts, get them, the parents who can afford to have lessons or, music lessons or dance lessons or art even lessons. And so I would love to see that the pandemic helps people realize what a lot of us know, that the arts are not a secondary thing, but that a lot of students enter into learning through the arts. I would love to see, as poor students online and all of this, particularly, and I'm thinking it's hard for all of us, and I was teaching online, but I teach college students who are adults. I can't imagine these elementary school kids and middle school, and it's just so hard. So I'm hoping that with this sort of challenge of having a whole generation of students now who have to come in, hopefully sooner than later, as long as it's safe for everyone, to come in, that maybe the standard models aren't the only way to do it, and the arts can help bridge these gaps. I would love to see that.
That's, brilliant to hear. Our next question is slightly worded weirdly, but I'll just go for it anyway. Who is responsible for changing access issues within the opera industry, and what do you think the next steps are? Again, quite a large question, but
it is. I think all of us are. I think a really important thing is, and we're beginning to see it, where boards and administrators and, just plain good sense of, we have all these movements about sort of awareness of representation, and particularly racial and ethnic representation. Let's get these folks, into the opera house. Let's show them that these goodies are good for everyone. I also think that a very underlooked thing is having people write to the board of directors, write to whoever it is and say, I want more opera that, reflects my experiences. I want to see more people of color on stage. Then I would go. So to let opera companies know that you want to feel welcomed and invited in there. Please do some programming for my school, for my community, for my church, for my office. Like opera companies and arts organizations have amazing talent right at their hands. And a lot of times when you have artists who come in, they're performing at night, but there's nothing to say. And a lot of companies do this, have them go into schools, have them go and do things that aren't just for an elitist group at the country club, although we love those folks too, but to have them sort of have a wider range while they're here. So I think all of us, we need, and please write those letters, talk to your companies. And if you send a letter like that, you can send it to anybody in an opera company and somebody is going to get it. It's going to be filtered through because we don't get enough of those. So that's sort of one really quick way of what can we do for the future? Say we want this, say that our feet, we will show up and be in, butts and seats, we'll be there, please program for us. And this is what we want.
Definitely. And I think I would add to that the importance I've seen, particularly for young people, in terms of social media and, contacting opera houses like that. Is that something you've seen as well?
Yes, I have. Now, I have to confess, though there are a lot of people in their 50s like me who are on social media, I am not. Email is about as good as I can do. I can barely keep up with that. However, so I'm all about writing letters and, there's a certain cachet about writing letters or send an email. That's good too. But social media, I have a 12-year-old and she is on TikTok and she's learning so much that, social media isn't the distraction that we used to think it was. I mean, it still can be, but there's still so much good that happens on there. So yes, that is a wonderful way to reach wide groups. I hear that a lot of the singers who I follow are on social media. So I try to get their they usually have a website too, but it's probably not as updated as their social media site. So social media, I think, is a big way to do it. Every company, every artistic organization needs to have somebody communicating. I mean, gone are the days where you could just sort of write it off. You're missing out if you're not.
Yeah, 100%. We just have time for one last question, which is probably the most difficult one, but maybe the most fun. You might know what it is, but do you have a favorite opera?
Oh, oh, that is a fun one because it changes.
Yeah, that's what I thought you might say.
Yeah, so right now I'm trying to get to know Anthony Davis's X, Life and Times of Malcolm X, his first opera from 1986. And there is a CD recording of it. So, and I didn't see it when it was first premiered, but I'm listening to the recording and I'm loving it. The more with new music, you can't, like any music, you've got to listen to it more than once, but I'm really pleased with how steep the curve is. When I listen to it just, for a third time, it's so different than the first or even the second time. So that's my favorite opera right now. Other operas, which I would drop anything and just go here. If I can afford to, go, if there's a Verdi Otello out there, it's just a beautifully organized. The music, even the in-between moments are just so wonderfully orchestrated. It's a big orchestra. If you can, maybe it's better to listen because this whole idea of blackface and who sings it can be a little distracting and difficult. But there's just so much richness. And Falstaff, I think I've been going through a late Verdi period lately where that opera, everything just begins and ends. It's so smooth. That's an amazing opera, and it's upbeat, and it's funny, and it's yeah, it's great. So sort of an interesting assortment, but those are the operas I'm thinking about right now.
Brilliant. And I would just add to that if you like Anthony Davis, then you can watch our talk with him that we did, I think a few months ago now, and it's all on our website. And he talks a lot about X and also the Central Park Five, which is his recent opera as well, which is brilliant.
Yes, I got to see that when it premiered at Long Beach. So important, so hard topic. Oh, thank you. I'm still learning about your website more, so I will definitely look that up.
Oh, brilliant. Well, Professor Naomi André, thank you so much for joining us today on Opera in Conversation. It's been great to speak to you, and I really hope that everyone will have got as much out of this conversation as I have.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure. And thanks everybody for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is it for Opera in Conversation for now. We're taking a small break next week, but we'll be back with lots more guests in the future. I've been Zelina Viliami. Thank you so much for watching.